Hello again, and welcome to Storytime, the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. Little different location this time. You can see plants behind me and sunshine. We have sunshine. The story we have today comes from a land that has a lot of sunshine, but also has a lot of rain and a lot of plants. This particular story comes from the country of Ireland, and it is called Brave Margaret. Once long ago, in the county of Donegal, there lived a young lady named Margaret. And Margaret lived all alone on a little farm that her family had lived on for years. On one side of the farm was the sea, and the rocks, and the cliffs. And on the other side of the farm was more cliffs and crags. There was just enough grass in between to raise a few cows. Not much, but just enough. And Margaret lived all alone, and she raised a few cows, and she grew what she could, and she went to the market and bought what she couldn't buy. But all her life, Margaret had longed for one thing, and that was to know what was on the other side of the sea, and what was on the other side of the cliffs. She always wondered. Well, one day, Margaret got up in the morning, and she washed her face and her hands, and she said her prayers, and she got herself dressed, and she had her breakfast, and she started to walk out the door of her house to go let the cows out of the barn for the day, to go graze in the grass. Well, when she walked out, she stopped just in front of the house, looking out at the sea, because there was a ship there, a big ship. And just coming up from the shore, up the path, was a man. And the man said to her, "Good day, my name is Simon. I am the son of the King of the East. And we are on a journey to the kingdom of cold, far in the north. But we've run short of food. Could we maybe buy some food from you so that we have food to make it to the kingdom of the cold?" Margaret thought about it for a moment. She said, "Well, I do have cows, and you could have my cows, but only if you take me with you," because she really, really, really wanted to see what was on the other side of the sea. And she thought this Simon looked rather nice, and she might like him a little bit, maybe. Well, Simon, being a good, strong man, did not want to take a girl with him on his ship. He was afraid that they would have to take care of her too much. And so he didn't want to take her along. But Margaret was adamant. She had decided she was going on the ship, and they would not have her cows if they would not take her. Well, they needed the food. So eventually Simon gave in. And Margaret and her cows got on the ship. And they started to sail away. They raised the big red and white striped sail, and they began to sail away. Well, they sailed for a while, and the wind pushed them at a good speed. But then, as the wind sometimes does on the ocean, it died down, and there was no more wind. And then the mist rolled in, and it was hard to see the ocean or where they were going. But they couldn't just sit there in the middle of the water. And so the sailors got out all the oars, and they started to row the ship. And Margaret got down, and she started to row the ship right alongside of them. She knew how to work, and she wasn't going to be a burden on them while they were traveling to see the world. Well, after about 2 days of this, the mist finally cleared, and the wind started to puff just a little, not enough to really blow the ship anywhere, but just a little. So the men took a break on the oars. And as they were standing there and sitting around taking a little bit of a break, suddenly the sea began to boil and roll and tumble and roll, and out of the ocean came a great sea serpent, and he looked at the ship, and he said, I see that you have a woman whose hair is like copper. Give me the red woman and I will let you go." "No," Simon said. He was not going to give them Margaret. And he pulled his sword to defend them against the sea serpent. But you see, Margaret didn't very much like the idea of the sea serpent attacking the ship because of her. And so while everyone else was getting their swords and getting ready to fight off the sea serpent, she went over to the other side of the ship and she very quietly lowered a little boat. And she sat down in the little boat and she began to row away from the ship. And she called back to the ship, "I will not have your deaths on my head. Now what happens is up to the will of God." Well, as soon as she called that, of course, the sea serpent noticed that she had gotten off of the boat. And so he went after her in her little rowboat. Well, as he started swimming towards her on the water, Margaret stood up in her little rowboat and she reached in and she pulled out an axe that she had brought off of the ship. And she took that axe in her hand and she knew she was on a boat on the ocean. She was not on steady ground. She was really good at this at home, but she was not on steady ground here. And so she knew that she would only have one try at this. And so she waited, and she waited, and she waited until that serpent got really close to her. And as he opened his big mouth to chomp down on that little boat and that Margaret too, she threw the axe. And it went straight down the serpent's throat and cut him open all inside. And he was dying. Oh, yes, he was dying. But if you've ever watched a serpent die, they kind of thrash around a bunch. And this serpent happened to be in the water that both of the boats were on. And so he thrashed around, and Simon and his ship went one way, and Margaret and her little boat went the other way. And they were separated. And Margaret, in all of the thrashing about, the little boat flew so fast that she fell back and she hit her head. And she went unconscious. And when she woke up, it was raining on her. And it was clearly much later in the day. And her little boat was sitting on a rocky shore of a little island. Or maybe it was a big island? She really couldn't tell from where she was at. All she could really see was a bunch of rocks and rain. Oh, and a light. Well, Margaret decided to head towards that light and see if maybe possibly there might be a kind person with that light that would give her some shelter. And as she got closer, she found that it was indeed a little hut. And when she went up, she knocked on the door, and there was an old woman came to the door. "Yes, my dear." "I'm so terribly sorry. My boat, it got lost on the sea, and I got separated from the ship, and could I possibly take shelter here? Please? It's raining so very hard." The old woman said, "Of course, dear. Come along inside." And Margaret went inside of the house. And the old lady let her sit next to the fire, and she brought her some bread and some milk. And Margaret ate the bread and milk, for she was very hungry by this time, and she looked about the house, and it was pretty much a normal little hut, except that there was something very odd on one wall. On one wall, there was a great big sword with a shining blade. It was so polished and so bright that it shone. And hanging next to it on a string was a silver ring. And Margaret thought that was a bit odd. And so she asked the old woman about it. And the old woman told her that once upon a time she had lived in a great house, it was almost a palace. It was so big. And it was called White Dune. And it was up on the inside of the island. But that a giant had come and had chased her away from her house of White Dune. And that the only person who could defeat that giant would be the champion who could wear the silver ring, because only the champion who could wear the silver ring could take the Sword of Light from the wall. Well, Margaret thought that was quite an interesting story, and she asked if any champions had come and tried to take the ring. And the old woman said, "Oh, yes, dearie, many have come. The ring is always too small, or for some it's too big, and then they can never take the sword off the wall, and they always end up fighting the giant anyway, because they're champions, they think they have to, and the giant always kills them. And, well, the palace of White Dune is actually black. But the ground around White Dune is white, with the bones of all of those champions who have tried to defeat the giant and lost." Well, that sounded quite terrifying, but since the giant didn't ever come down to the shore, Margaret figured they'd be safe for a day or two until the storm let up. Well, the storm didn't let up. It rained, and it blew, and it poured, and it blew some more for days and days and days. And whenever there was a break in the rain for just a few minutes, Margaret would go outside and she would look out to see if maybe she could see Simon's ship. She was very worried about him because, you see, by this time she was more than a little in love with him. And she was so afraid that his ship would be damaged in this storm, and all she could think was that he might be clinging to a rock out there in the water, and she needed to go save him. And as much as she enjoyed living with the old woman and helping her around the house, she needed to go find Simon and make sure he was okay. And so one day she decided that she didn't care if it was raining and storming. She was going to go find Simon in the morning anyway. So in the morning she got up, and she got a few pieces of food together, and she got herself dressed, and she said her prayers, and she got ready to go out to the little boat on the shore and go find Simon. And just as she was getting her things together to leave, there was a knock on the door. And when she went and opened the door, who should be standing there but Simon? He had been looking for her the entire time. And he was so happy to see her, and he said, "Oh, thank goodness you're all right. Now we will never be parted again." And Margaret said, "Oh, I like that idea. Let's go." And the old woman said, No, wait a moment. You're not going anywhere." And Margaret said, "Well, who are you to tell me whether I can go or can stay?" And the old woman said, "Your young man there, he's a champion. He must try to fight the giant." And so Margaret told Simon all about the giant. She said, "But you can't make him fight any more than you can make me stay." And the old woman said, "Oh, can't I now?" And Simon said, "I will stop you." And he reached for his sword. And the old woman said, "But you can't draw your sword any more than the young woman can leave." And sure enough, when Simon tried to reach for his sword, he found that his arm had no life in it, and he couldn't even lift it. And when Margaret tried to move to the door to leave, she found that her feet were stuck to the floor and she couldn't move. So finally Simon said, "Well, all right, old woman, I will try to be your champion. What do I have to do?" And the old woman said, "You take the ring that hangs there on the wall and you put it on your finger." Well, Simon went over and he took down the ring and he tried to put it on his finger, and it was too small. And she said, "Well, you can try to lift the sword." And he tried to take that sword off the wall. He really did. You see, he wanted to go home and take Margaret with him. But he couldn't take the sword off the wall. And the old woman said, "Oh, too bad. You're not the right champion." "Well, that's all right. You can leave, young man. But the red woman, she stays here with me. She will be a good prize. She will draw many champions here." And Simon said, "No, she will not. I'm taking her with. I'm going to go fight the giants, and then we can leave." Well, Simon got on one of the horses from the old woman's stable, and she said, "The horse will take you to White Dune. Ride off, young man." And so he got on the horse and he rode off to White Dune. Well, after a little while of pacing back and forth, Margaret was very worried about Simon. The old woman got up and she went to the fire and she took a pinch of some herbs that were in a can and she threw them into the fire. And much to Margaret's surprise, suddenly in the fire she could see White Doon, the big black palace with the white bones of all of the dead champions spread about below it. And as she watched, she could see a little man on a horse ride up, and she knew that was Simon. And then suddenly the door of the castle banged back, and a giant came out with a great big cudgel in his hands, and he said, "Fee, fum, fo, fey, what foolish mortal comes this way? Champion or king's son, knave or churl? Churl or knave, my giant club will send him to his grave." And they began to fight. And the giant swung at Simon, and Simon ducked. And Simon swung at the giant, and he gave him many cuts, but none of them were lethal. And before too long, Simon began to tire. And suddenly the giant swung his cudgel, and it hit Simon, and he fell lifeless to the ground. Well, as you can imagine, Margaret was quite distraught. No, that was the love of her life, and he was dead. He couldn't be dead. And she stood up and she backed away from the fire so fast that she lost her balance. And when she fell against the wall, and in her hand, when she came down, she was holding the ring. And just to keep it safe, as she stood up, she slipped it on her finger, and lo and behold, it fit perfectly. And she looked at the old woman and she said, "What fools we have been! Why did we think it had to be a man to be the champion? I am your champion, old woman. The ring fits me." And she turned around and she reached up to the wall, and even though it had been so terribly difficult for all of the champions, including Simon, she reached up and she put her hand on that sword, and it came right off the wall, and she carried it out the door with her. She went out to the stable and she saddled a horse, and she got on that horse and she rode as fast as she could up to that castle. And she saw Simon's body lying there, and it just made her more determined. And so she rode up to the castle, and as she rode up, the door banged open and the giant stepped out, and he said, "Fee, fum, fo, fey, what foolish mortal comes this way? Champion or king's son, churl or knave, one blow from my cudgel will send him to his grave." And Margaret looked at him and said, "Her, not him." And she began to fight. And they fought, and they fought, and the giant swung his club, and Margaret ducked. And the giant swung his club again, and Margaret slipped out of the way, and she reached out and she cut the giant. And he was rather laughing a bit, because the giant had gotten used to beating people. But when she reached out with the sword of light and she slashed across his legs, the giant's laughter turned to a roar of pain. He had not been hurt like that in a very long time. Such was the power of the sword of light. And they continued to fight, and before too long the giant began to tire, and Margaret slashed at his feet, and she cut them out from underneath him, and as he fell to his knees, she reached out and she said, "For Simon!" and she cut off the giant's head. And then she dropped the sword of light beside the lifeless giant, and she went over and she began crying by Simon's lifeless body. And as she looked up, she saw the woman in front of her. Then she knew must be a witch. And she said, "Go away with you. You have cost me the life of my love." And the old woman said, "No, not so, my dear. Come with me." And she took Margaret with her into the palace of White Doon. And she went in and she found a very large wooden box that was carved very ornately. And she opened the box, and inside the box was a green bottle. And she held up the bottle and she said, "This, my dear, is the water of life." And she reached in with her finger and she got just one drop on her finger, and she put it on her own forehead, and suddenly there she was standing in front of Margaret, a tall, young, dark-haired woman. She said, "Take this, my dear, take it, and go and sprinkle some on your love." And so Margaret took the bottle, and she took it out to Simon, and she took a few drops on her fingers, and she sprinkled them over Simon, and he sprang back up, alive as he had ever been. And they hugged each other, and they said, "We'll never be parted again." And they went down to the sea, and they got on their boat, and they went back to the kingdom of the East where Simon's father ruled. And when Simon's father met Margaret and heard the whole story, he was so pleased to meet her. And Simon and Margaret were married, and their wedding feast lasted 9 days and 9 nights. But their happiness and their joy at being together lasted for their entire lives. And that is the story of Brave Margaret, a story that comes to us from Ireland. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you again on Monday at 3 p.m. Central Daylight Time on the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois Facebook page, and we'll have another story for you. Have a great weekend. Bye!